Good morning. I can't hear anyone.
Morning.
We can hear you, Lynn.
Good
How
morning.
are you?
Hi.
Morning, Lynn.
Good morning.
Hello, Lynn. Good morning. Good morning, everyone.
Oh, hi, Mario.
Let me start the videos.
You'll have to
Hello,
start the
Jane.
video.
Hi, I'm just trying to start my video.
Oh,
Oh,
You
you
need
can so
permission
far,
from-
Jane. Just a second.
Right, yeah, Mario doesn't want to see me.
no, nor me.
Fair enough.
I'm not saying anything.
Someone.
Yeah. Oh, fair enough for me, not you, Lynn.
Okay, can we?
No, we still can't start the video.
Just this is always the same problem in the morning. I have a setting which I have to change, and I always forget from where to change it. It's like I feel like I'm driving a plane.
Well, I'm not sure I'd like to be on that
Before-
plane.
I was
before
going to say,
trying
I'm
to
quite
fly.
glad you're not.
I am
Not
so
even
delighted
flying.
you're not. This is your captain, I think, speaking. I don't know where the button is to get this
I'm
plane.
sure
Oh,
we
here
did
it
this
is.
yesterday.
Yeah.
Hello.
We learned this in pilot school, I'm sure.
Okay, here it is.
Hi, guys.
Hi, David.
Hi, David.
Oh, you've done it. Well done, Mario.
Oh,
Thank
excellent.
Thank you for the third
you. We have
time. Yes.
lift off.
There we are.
Hi, Jane. Hi,
Hi.
David. Hi, Anna.
Hi, Anna.
Hi, Anna. How are you?
Morning, Anna.
So can all the participants see all of us? I guess they can.
Yes.
There are 30
yes.
odd people. It's good.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. We can't see you, but you can see us.
We know you're there.
But we know you're there. So I'm going to share my screen this morning, right?
Yes.
But
yes.
I'm going to wait until a few more people have arrived, perhaps.
Shall I already launch the poll then? Is it okay if I launch the poll now?
Oh, yes, please. Yeah.
Mm,
Yeah. So for those who are here already, we have a
Yeah.
question to ask you this morning, which is linked to something that will come in my presentation. I can't remember what the question is now. Will I see it as well? And I can
It
take
should,
people
come up
through
in front of
it.
your, it should come up on your screen for everybody, but it'll tell you can't answer it or
Mm.
you're a panelist or something like
Shall we allow the panelists to vote then as well? Or is it the training course participants?
Whatever's easy. It doesn't. I mean, it's just to get people thinking really
Okay.
about how they would respond to the question. Here we go.
There you go.
So this question is, I want you to think about what stops research on nature-based solutions being used in policy. And you have a set of 10 options here, and I want you to just select up to 3 that you think are the most important. So why isn't research that researchers are doing being used in policy? And if you could answer that in the next, have a read of those and answer it in the next 20 minutes or so, that would be great.
It's an interesting question.
Yeah. There isn't another option. You have to choose one of those 10, unfortunately, or up to 3 of them. So if you can think of another reason, you can write it in the chat. Shall I share my screen?
Yes,
Then.
you can do that.
So I think what I want to do is that.
Wow.
Now you can see a hummingbird.
Yep.
Beautiful. And then now you should see my first slide.
Yep.
Okay. So I will just start. This is a lecture about how to interact with policy and influence, how to interact with policymakers and influence policy. As an outline of what I'm going to say, it's going to be about, first of all, what is policy and legislation? I'm going to focus on policy from the UK initially, and particularly policy and legislation related to wildlife or biodiversity. Now, this is partly because this is an area, it's my country, so it's the country where I understand the policy landscape and know the legislation very well. And I'm looking at wildlife, but I want to be very clear that's one aspect of the policy and legislation that's relevant to nature-based solutions. And the purpose of showing you the detail on this part of it is really to give you an overview and an idea of how complex policy and legislation are. And as you're listening to this and thinking about this, be aware in the back of your mind that this is one aspect of the policy and legislation that's relevant to nature-based solutions. I'm going to talk about international conservation policy, and then there's a section about how to influence policy. This is mostly geared towards people working in research. I think there might be many people in the course here who are already working in policy. So I hope that it's interesting to you as well to see this perspective. But you will know, I'd assume that if you're working in policy, you'll know some of the things, perhaps not for the UK. So as a starting point, what's the difference between policy and legislation? For me, it's very clear, and there's some guidance notes produced by the British Ecological Society on policy in the UK, which you might find useful. There's a list of references in a final slide at the end of this presentation, which you'll be able to see later on when the presentations are shared. So policy is a course or principle of action adopted or proposed by an organisation or an individual. Legislation sets out the law, and so it's the procedures and standards that people or organisations must follow. It's mandatory. A policy is just a direction of travel or an area. So you can use laws to enforce a policy. And this is something that's happening in the UK at the moment as we leave the European Union. We're gradually enacting a number of laws which are making it necessary or mandatory to have the policy which we're going to leave the European Union, as an example. Not my favourite one. Policies can also be adopted as a way of fulfilling legislative commitments. So either policy or legislation can come first, and these two concepts interact together. As an example of a policy, I'm going to use Biodiversity 2020, which was the biodiversity strategy in the UK. It was actually created in 2011 or from 2010 onwards. So in the UK, if we're looking at the policy and legislation related to wildlife specifically, I'm going to just show you who the main players are, the main organisations and people who are involved in all of this. We have a government department called the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. It should be for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, or we call it DEFRA. Every country in the world will have something similar to this, will have some kind of department of environmental something, and the names will be different. The names within a country will change over time as well. So that in itself is a complexity. In the UK, we have devolved nations. So we have Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, and these parts of the UK have different laws in some areas and different responsibilities in some areas. So on the right here, you see a list of the areas of policy which are devolved to the other governments, and that includes agriculture, education, environment, housing, law and order, health, and local government. And what that means is that a lot of the policies that are present in England for some really key areas relating to wildlife and environment are actually different in Scotland and different in Wales and different again in Northern Ireland. So this makes it a very interesting and complex policy landscape. In England, we have a set of agencies who are really important if you care about looking after biodiversity. Natural England, Environment Agency, Forestry Commission, Rural Payments Agency. These are on fairly long timescales, changing all the time. They merge, they separate, they get called different things over long periods of time, but basically have agencies that have particular areas of responsibility. And there are separate versions of these for the devolved administrations, such as Scotland. And then there are national bodies like the Joint Nature Conservation Committee, which oversee information and data on biodiversity and advise government for the whole of the UK. You can already start to see what a complex landscape it is. There are also many different stakeholders involved in setting policy and making legislation on biodiversity and more broadly on the environment. So this actually comes from the DEFRA website. This is the Department of Environment's own view of all its important bodies. I think you can all see that, so I'll just take that away. That was a reminder of the poll. And just to show you how many different organisations there are non-ministerial departments attached to DEFRA, there are executive agencies that work alongside DEFRA, and there are non-departmental public bodies. Each one of these blue dots is a government organisation of some kind involved in policy and legislation related to wildlife. Oh, sorry, the slides have stopped moving for some reason. Why did that happen? I'll just go out of it and come back. Sorry, don't know why that happened. There we go. So here are some people. If you're not from the UK, you've probably never seen any of these people before. If you are from the UK, you might recognise some of them. Or you might know who they all are. They are all secretaries of state for the environment, food and rural affairs. So these people are the top decision makers when it comes to environmental law in the UK. And you can see what I've written on this slide for you is both the period of time that they were the Secretary of State and their main professional experience before they became the Secretary of State for Environment, and the years that they held that position. So we have actually nobody in this set of people who has any real professional experience in wildlife conservation or environmental science. The closest we have is the current Secretary of State, which is George Eustace, because he has a farming background. He's responsible for environment and agriculture. We have journalists, financiers, business people, accountants, and Caroline Spellman was an agricultural lobbyist. And the reason for showing you this is the person that really makes the final decision on environmental laws and policy in the UK. So, for example, with the Biodiversity 2020 strategy, which was first drafted in 2010 in response to a European strategy, this was drawn up with Caroline Spellman in charge. And then it basically ping-pongs its way between all of these different people to reach where we are today, which is 2020, where George Eustace is in charge. Now, how well those individual people understand what's in that strategy and the many other strategies they're responsible for, or buy into it on a personal level, or are behind it, obviously varies by people. And so this is the kind of context in which policy happens and is managed. And it's really important to understand that. There are clearly a whole host of people underneath within the department who do understand the policy, but the ultimate decision making is with these people. And they can make a huge difference to how well something is actually delivered on the ground. So that was one example of a policy. Where do government policies come from? This is a diagram to take you through a process, and this is how it works in the UK. I think it's similar but different in other countries. So we have green papers and white papers, and then bills and acts. So on these slides, the policies are in green or surrounded in green, and the legislation or the law is in blue. So what you would have is you would initially you'd have a policy that might be a green paper. This is a draft with the dashed lines. And then you might have some consultation, which then leads to a white paper, which is stated and agreed government policy. And then a white paper might lead to something called a bill, which is draft legislation. And that would eventually, having gone through the Houses of Parliament, it would be agreed and become actual law as an act. There could be strategies that come out of white papers. There can be strategies, agreed policy documents that come out of law, acts, and acts can also lead to white papers. So there's lots of interacting possibilities here. Where does this all come from? Well, largely you have policy that comes from political manifestos. In our case, it's very raw in our minds that we also have referendums or public votes which lead to policies. Until recently, we also have European directives and European strategies, and we have international agreements which lead to policies at national level. So some of our important wildlife laws in the UK are the Wildlife and Countryside Act, which is from 1981, and the Natural Environment and Rural Communities Act from 2006, which was then amended in the Conservation of Habitats and Species Regulations from 2010. Now, there's a lot of detail here, but the main thing I wanted to say is that the Wildlife and Countryside Act in 1981, I was very young then, but I can imagine when it came in, it was a really great success for conservationists in the UK. It comes from European legislation originally, but one of the things, it's very strong and it legally protects all wild birds and their nests during breeding. It's actually illegal to kill any wild birds, and it legally protects a number of specific animals and plants that are listed in schedules by species. So it's very much representing what now seems like a relatively old-fashioned approach to wildlife conservation, which is to list particular species that are threatened, and you also have habitats that are threatened in the acts that come after it. Now, I'm just going to tell you a story to illustrate what it means when you have a piece of legislation that protects wildlife. And we have the Wildlife and Countryside Act in the UK, which makes it illegal to kill any wild birds. But we also have a situation in the UK where there's a set of about 15 bird species which it is okay to kill. And the government issues licenses to kill those birds, and that's because those birds are considered pests. And the example that I've got in the pictures here is crows, and actually several species of corvid, which are hated by many people because they're blamed for killing livestock. They apparently peck the lives out, they peck the eyes from lambs and rip their tongues out when they've just been born. So people really hate them, and farmers like to kill them. And many conservationists also dislike corvids because they eat birds' eggs, so they'll eat the eggs of ground nesting birds. Last year there was a campaign by an organisation called Wild Justice, led by this chap in the middle, Chris Packham, and a couple of other people, which actually took the government to court for its general licenses. So there were 16 species of wild bird on the general licenses that you could kill without fear of prosecution, and there was no need to prove that they were causing any damage. You could just kill them at will. And these people said, this isn't right. Why are we allowing this? We're supposed to be protecting our wild birds. The response to the announcement that they would take the government to court was this bottom picture here. People were very, very angry, to the extent that they actually hung up dead crows on the gateway of the house of this campaigner, Chris Packham. So quite gruesome, quite a horrible thing to do. There was a lot of media coverage of this. What then happened is that DEFRA, the government department, withdrew the 3 general licenses to kill wild birds at very short notice, causing a huge amount of anger among some of the farming groups, for example. They then had a consultation which lasted for 10 days, nothing like enough time to give organisations time to respond. And then they reissued some new general licenses with amended species lists. So they had a very, very quick look at the evidence on all the species that were on the list to see whether there was evidence that they actually caused damage, and then they reissued the licenses. The current situation is that we're now waiting for a consultation on the general licenses, which was planned for 2020. And the reason for telling you this is because during that process, which happened in 2019, there were 3 species of bird which were removed from the general licenses. 2 species of gull, the lesser black-backed gull and the herring gull, on the left and right at the top, and the collared dove. And the gulls were removed because they're actually red or orange listed in the UK as species of conservation concern because their populations are declining. And the collared dove was removed because there is no evidence really of it having any negative impact. So since then, there have been more than 1,000 applications for specific licenses to kill those 2 gull species. So people still want to kill them, even though they're declining and they're a conservation concern. And the reason for telling you this is just to point out that even when you have what seems like the strongest protection of environment that you can have, an act which makes it illegal and it's enforced to kill specific species, you have to be continually vigilant about whether the law is properly working in the way that it should, because it will be not always followed and interpreted in different ways, and it can end up with species which should be protected being killed for no good reason at all. Going on to policy, UK policy, there are some really important policy documents relating to, particularly to wildlife protection in the UK. The National Planning Policy Framework is one of those. Again, these are often changing in response to new government policies. We have this biodiversity strategy, which should be being replaced very soon this year. We have a marine strategy. We have a 25-year environment plan, and we have a national pollinator strategy. These are just some examples, and with the little stars here, I'm showing you which ones of these are actually have separate policies in the different administrations in Britain. All of this complexity would be true in any country. So as a case study, going back to my diagram of how policies get made and how laws get made, if you take the Biodiversity 2020 policy, that was originally, it comes out of an EU Biodiversity Strategy 2010, and that led to a white paper in Britain called the Natural Environment White Paper, which was written with stakeholder consultation, and that then led to this biodiversity strategy. There's no connected legislation. Here's another case study. We now have something called the Environment Bill. And that's being looked at still. It's still sitting in Parliament at the moment, but that actually comes about because of Brexit, because we had a referendum in this country. We decided to leave the European Union, which leaves a massive hole in our environmental regulations, as you can imagine. And so in response to that, we developed a 25-year environment plan, which is basically a strategy, a policy. And then there's been some consultation. There have been many consultations, but one of them was on biodiversity net gain. And now we have a bill which is going through the Houses of Parliament very, very slowly this year. We're still waiting to see where it gets to. And eventually it should become the Environment Act 2025 or something like that. Who knows? So all of this sits in the context of international policy and legislation or regulations. So we have international European Union type laws, which as we've left the European Union in Britain, won't apply to us after the end of this year, but for all the other European nations, member states, they will. Here you have a Parliament and the European Commission. You have, from a biodiversity perspective, the main laws are what are called the nature directives, the Birds Directive and the Habitats Directive. And it's important to say that the Habitats Directive and the Birds Directive do actually make law, and there's the European Court of Justice can make rulings on the basis of these and has the power to fine member states. So here's an example of cases that go, there's in the Habitats Directive, there's Article 6, which says that member states shall take appropriate steps to avoid deterioration of natural habitats, for example. And this actually has teeth. Here are some teeth. As an example of a case here, Ireland was taken to the European Court of Justice for not adopting measures needed to prevent the deterioration in the Owenduff Neffin Beg complex protected area because it wasn't protecting the habitats for the species for which that area was designated because of overgrazing by sheep. Some of you in this audience might know more about this than I do, but this is what the place looks like, and this is one of the species that should be protected. So there's an opportunity for countries to actually be taken to court and fined for not following this European legislation. In Britain, as I've already said, we now have a huge governance gap for environmental protection, and this was pointed out by one of our parliamentary committees in 2017. We appear to be trying to do something about it, but it's nothing like fast enough. We are going to face a situation where we don't really know what the law says on many, many different environmental regulations and policies, I believe. So what we have coming up is an agriculture bill to replace the Common Agricultural Policy, an environment bill, a fisheries bill, a new post-2020 biodiversity strategy. These are all currently at some kind of point in the processes I've been showing you, and it's actually very difficult if you're outside policy organisations to keep track and find out what's going on with all these different things. To get any access to the text can be quite hard, to influence it even more difficult. On a much broader scale, there's an international context to all of this. So I think it's right to say that it all started here. I don't know whether people know where that star is pointing to. It's actually a place called Ramsar in Iran. And I'm showing you that because Ramsar was the first international environmental convention. So the international conventions are legally binding international treaties. And the Ramsar Convention was adopted in 1971, and it was about the conservation and wise use of wetlands and their resources. And it designated particular sites. Now, the reason this was the first international convention on environmental issues was largely because wetlands, there were lots of very big internationally important wetland sites for wildlife which crossed national boundaries, and so they couldn't actually be protected by individual nations. So now we have a number of these. We have CITES on international trade in endangered species. We have the Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is just at the moment negotiating legally binding instruments on the conservation of marine biodiversity, quite late to the party on biodiversity. We have the Framework Convention on Climate Change, you'll be familiar with, and we have the Convention on Biological Diversity. So these are operating at global scales, they're having regular meetings. And just if you want to find out more about any of these, they each have pretty excellent websites. You can find out what's going on. You can look at all the meetings. This is, for example, the website for the Convention on Biological Diversity. And you can see on these websites, you can find out about the protocols within those treaties. So for the CBD, the Biological Diversity Convention, you have the Cartagena Protocol, which was signed in Cartagena in Colombia, and it's about the safe use of genetically modified organisms. You have the Nagoya Protocol, which is about ownership of genetic resources. This one is interesting because it's hitting us in research right now. I don't know whether this is happening in other countries, but universities in the UK are just being held to account for the Nagoya Protocol. We have to declare if we're using any genetic resources from any countries other than the UK now. And it's meeting with a complete lack of understanding, I would say, from quite a lot of researchers who don't really understand where it comes from. So lots of interesting detail there. And then you can see who the parties to the treaties are, which are the countries that have signed these international treaties. So for the CBD, the last time I looked, there are 196 parties. That's countries that turn up and go to the and send delegations to the meetings, and 168 of them have actually signed the treaty. So they're the signatories to this. The meetings where all of the parties get together are called conferences of the parties, or COPs. The CBD had a COP14 in Egypt in 2018, and it was supposed to have one this year, which has now been postponed to next spring. And you'll have these meetings last 2 weeks or so. You'll have a high-level segment, quite somewhere in it, which is a couple of days where the really senior politicians turn up. So here I'm showing you a photograph of the COP14 of the Convention on Biological Diversity in Egypt, just to give you a sense of what it's like at these meetings. So on the stage, leading the meeting, you will have the executive secretary for the convention, and you'll have some really senior politicians. So here you've got the Minister of Environment for Egypt, which is the government, the host government. You've got the Ambassador of Mexico to Egypt, who's got the presidency, and you've got the Minister of Natural Resources and Environment from Thailand in the audience. These people sitting on the floor here, they are the government delegations, and in the high-level segment, they should be the very senior politicians, like the secretaries of state for environment, or in some cases even the prime ministers that I was showing you earlier. They actually turn up to these meetings, and they all sit around discussing what we're going to do as a world about climate change, biodiversity. So within this, there are some important groups of people. So each of the United Nations international treaties has a secretariat, has appointed leadership committees, has technical or scientific advisory bodies, which are usually largely made up of scientists working in government. And then they have government delegations from both the ratifying and the non-ratifying, or the non-signing nations. And they also allow official observers who can attend, but they can't say anything. So that would be groups of NGOs are often at these meetings. Again, these international treaties do have some legal teeth. It's possible for a country to take another country to the International Court of Justice in The Hague for not adhering to the agreements in this, but it relies on a country. There's no overseeing body that will take a country to court for not doing it. A country can take another country. So this is your overview of environmental legislation from national to international level. In this international context, from a UK perspective or from a European perspective, you have some important policies. You have the European Union Biodiversity Strategy. You have the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity, which has produced the Aichi targets and is now being rewritten for post-2020. And you have the Sustainable Development Goals, which have been agreed by the United Nations. I wanted to specifically point people towards the new European Union biodiversity strategy here, because it was agreed only in June this year, and it's actually an astonishing document from my perspective, because it has some really radical and very specific targets in it. It's really worth looking at. It includes an EU nature restoration plan with concrete commitments to restore degraded ecosystems by 2030. Nature-based solutions, which is what this training is about, are specifically mentioned, I counted 10 times in this document, including very clear commitments to use nature as part of dealing with climate change. So this is a direct quote from the biodiversity strategy. As nature restoration will make a major contribution to climate objectives, a significant proportion, doesn't say how much, of the 25% of the EU budget dedicated to climate action will be invested on biodiversity and nature-based solutions. And there are many other really very supportive statements in this strategy. So it remains to be seen how this plays out in national governments, what it actually turns into in action on the ground. We wait to see, but as a starting point for the next 10 years of biodiversity strategy, I would say this is quite excellent. Do go and have a look at it. This is where you can find the Aichi targets if you're interested in finding out more about those. The only thing I want to say about those, they were signed in Aichi in 2010, is that the working group that was set up to devise the new post-2020 biodiversity strategy for the whole world started off from the perspective of looking at the Aichi targets and seeing an almost utter failure of them. They weren't met. Most of them weren't met. So this is the backdrop to the new work that's going on at the moment. We set these ambitious targets in 2010. That's where we are. So the next part of my lecture is about how to influence policy. Given how complex it all is, I hope I've given you a good insight into how complicated just one area of environmental policy can look. How on earth do you influence this as a researcher? And there's some key things to do here. The first is you need to engage in formal consultation processes. They happen all the time. Every government will have consultation processes going on. In the UK, we have gov.uk website. There's a whole page dedicated to consultations. You can go and find out. When I looked at it for this, there were 25 open consultations and 467 had been closed. So this is a chance for you to make some comments and feed into government policy. And it's really worth engaging with that because anybody can. You need to build informal networks with civil servants and engage with science policy interface mechanisms. So two of the big ones in this area are the IPBES, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and the IPCC, which is the Panel on Climate Change. These have scientists and early career research fellows, in the case of IPBES, who work with them to write assessment reports. And if you can get involved in that process, it's a really useful way of understanding the science, the policy landscape. You can take opportunities to work within government with policy internships. And it's really important, I'm not going to say very much about this because we have Anna speaking on this later, but it's very important to communicate relevant research in a tailored format at the right time. So this is the question I asked you. I don't know whether we've got the results of the survey yet. Have we, is it possible to see them? This is,
I'm sharing the results now.
Hey, okay. So when I asked you what stops research on nature-based solutions being used in policy, the top answer, thank you very much for doing this, everybody. The top answer was nature is not a political priority, which is in total agreement with the results of a survey of 758 people from 68 countries that was published in 2018, led by David Rose. But also the top answer there was conservation is not a political priority. So that's interesting, but you also felt that policymakers don't understand the science and private sector agendas are prioritized. Your lowest answer was scientists don't understand policy, which is interesting. And also quite similar in the results here, although not quite as low. So thanks for doing that. I wonder whether it's going to mess up my slides again if I close this. I don't know. So the results of this survey, very similar to what you've just said. I mean, this really lends weight to the audience here and the views of the people who conducted this survey. What stops conservation science being used in policy? And they were asked to score between 1 and 8 here. And yeah, I'm just going to have to escape. When you show me a survey, it stops my presentation from working. Interesting. The top answers were conservation, which is exactly the same as you. Conservation is not a political priority, and the priority of the private sector's agenda is higher. Those are the top answers here. And this is why, so it's about policy priorities rather than anything about so much about communication. But there's also an interesting one here, which is mismatch of timescales. And this is something I'll talk a little bit more about. And bad communication was scored reasonably high by this survey as well. So this was done by policymakers, practitioners, and researchers from around the world. And you can see where in the world they came from on these maps on the left. The references at the end, by the way. And then in the same survey, people were asked, so what are the solutions to this? Well, how can we increase the use of conservation science? And the results were broken down according to what the barrier was, what the problem was. So if the problem is conservation is not a political priority, the solutions to solving that, according to this large survey of people, are that we need to demonstrate the benefits of conservation and use different measures of prosperity so that conservation becomes a political priority. If you look at people saying that the problem is bad communication, the way to solve that is to have collaboration between scientists and policymakers and to have more knowledge brokers, so people working in between science and policy. Those were the main responses to that as a barrier. So I'm going to just talk in the last bit of my lecture is about the importance of timing. And there's a concept of a policy cycle. Policies they don't just appear out of nowhere. They're continually evolving and developing. And you can think of it as a kind of cycle where you have an agenda being set and then a policy is formulated and then it's adopted, then it's implemented, then it gets evaluated, and after that it might be revised, or you might have a new agenda that sets a new, and this is a kind of continual process that's always going on in policy. But if you are working on nature-based solutions or actually any aspect of the environment, you're not just interested in one area of policy. We have an expression in English, you have a whole raft of policies that are important here. So this is why this is a broken up raft in my image here. From a perspective of conservation, you have urban planning policy, you have research policy, agricultural policy, pesticides policy, and each of these areas of policy is on their own policy cycle because they're operating independently of each other. And the important point here is that they're not always in sync. So to illustrate this, I want to talk to you about the UK, the National Pollinator Strategy for England, which I happen to have been quite involved in the development of a few years ago. We're going to hear a lot more about pollinator strategies from Jane in a later talk. But the National Pollinator Strategy for England was actually agreed in the end of November 2014. So here's a timeline of the development of that strategy. And it was announced that it was going to be a strategy in June 2013, and it was finally agreed in November of the following year. At the same time, there's a different policy cycle going on, which is agricultural policy, and this is related to the common agricultural policy in Europe. We had proposals for reform in 2010, consultations at national level in 2011, proposals voted in Europe in 2013, and then enacted in 2013. And in the UK, that was all leading into national agricultural policy consultation in 2013, final schemes announced for agri-environment schemes in 2014. So the important thing here is that the policy formulation happened at the same time, which meant that there was an opportunity. This is one of the people I showed you earlier. This is Liz Truss, who at the time, for a short period of time only, was the Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. And she was very excited to announce that we had a new agri-environment scheme just for pollinators, which is called the New Wild Pollinator and Farm Wildlife Package, when she announced it in 2014. But the reason that was possible is because the agricultural policy formulation was happening at the same time as the pollinator policy. By contrast, this is the same timeline for the pollinator strategy on the bottom. Let's look at the pesticides policy timelines on the top. We have some evidence that neonicotinoids were really bad for bees. Coming first in 2012, we have decisions by the European Food Safety Authority. The UK didn't agree with them. And then we have a UK consultation on the National Pesticides Action Plan in 2012, which was then agreed in February 2013. So the pesticides policy formulation was not happening at the same time as the National Pollinator Strategy. The result of that is that there's almost nothing on pesticides in the National Pollinator Strategy. And that is the reason. There wasn't an opportunity. So there's a concept which has been written about in the literature of policy windows. And what this idea says is that if you want to change policy, you have to have three things in place. You have to have strong public interest. You have to have a feasible solution on the table, but there has to also be an opportunity for policy change. And if all those things happen at the same time, then you get policy change, as we did for the agri-environment schemes and pollinators in the UK. If you have strong public interest and a feasible solution, as we had for neonicotinoid pesticides in the UK, but there's no opportunity for policy change, then you don't get policy change. That's the policy window concept. And that's why timing and understanding the policy landscape is so important to influencing policy. So to summarize all of that, how can nature-based solutions researchers interact with policymakers and influence policy? You need to understand the policy landscape in all its complexity. You need to get the timing right. When are there opportunities to influence? Which policies are changing? And the final really important thing, which I haven't talked about yet, is that you need to tailor your messages to particular audiences and to particular policies at the right time when they're changing. For nature-based solutions, as I've said at the start, there are many different policy areas involved here. So it's a full-time job to interact fully with policymakers and influence policy. Thanks for listening. That's the end of my talk. There's a list of references here, but I think we will share the slides at the end for people who are interested. And there's also a slide of useful web resources. So if you're watching this after the end of the training course, you feel free to contact me on Twitter or email to ask for these. Thanks.
Thank you, Lynn. I think there's a few questions already in the Q&A section.
There's only 1 minute left to answer them, sorry.
Well, let's start with these, and then and then we can have. I mean, the chat is always open, so we can have an exchange there as well. So Emily is saying that corruption may be another reason for nature-based solutions not being taken up in policy. And it's a long question, so or comment, so maybe you'd like to comment on that. There's another similar question, not on corruption, but another so it's another factor we could have considered in the poll, and that is policymakers not trusting nature-based solutions as a solution that they would sort of use. So maybe you would like to comment. The full questions are in the Q&A section, Lynn. But,
yeah, I see them. So corruption is a really interesting and difficult issue. I think that there's a tendency for corruption in every administration, and it's varying levels. It's very, very hard to guard against, and the problem is there's a huge trade-off, because in guarding against corruption, you make things almost impossible to do. So, for example, in Europe and in Britain, we have really quite strong procurement laws that make it very, very difficult to just give money to a particular company that you happen to know and like, and that's a guard against corruption. But the fact that we have the procurement laws makes it extremely difficult to do things in a quick and efficient way. So there's a complex trade-off going on there, and I would say that probably no country in the world has got this right. There are some better and some worse, and there are corruption scales that you can look at for the whole world to see how well people are doing. But it's not something I can solve today. I agree, it's super important in nature-based solutions and in any area of environmental policy to be right about that. There's a question, is there any possibility of removing the environment from political agendas? I believe it should be untouchable by politicians. So I mean, the thing is, as we saw in the survey of the audience here and the one that's published, conservation and nature just isn't a political priority usually. And I don't understand why it's not a political priority, but it's just not something that health seems to always come higher than it, and employment and economy, even though we've been making the case for many years, decades, that actually nature underpins all of these things. It's not a political priority. So I think you're proposing that it just becomes not something that's in the political arena. It's just something that happens automatically. I don't think that's possible. I think that in order to have something that has laws and requirements around it, it has to be in the political arena, because the government has to oversee that. If you don't have it in the political arena, then it's not democracy, would be my answer to that.
I guess, Lynn, that's as you were saying, many scientists, many experts, and economists have been making the case of the linkages between for the environment, in terms of the linkages that there are between the environment, health, and the other social and economic benefits. And that's one way of looking at it. I guess we should expect that to become more of a priority. I mean, in policies, and especially now with the concepts like ecosystem services and nature-based solutions. And
I'd like to quickly answer Irina's question. Have you considered including in the poll that policymakers did not trust nature-based solutions? So I gave you the options that were in the paper only. And they were for conservation more generally. But I think that if that had been in the poll, it would probably have been the top answer. For nature-based solutions, there is a huge problem that, first of all, we haven't demonstrated that they work, either in evidence or in demonstration on the ground yet enough for people who don't trust them or understand them well to be convinced. And with any environmental solution, there's going to be a more variable outcome. You can easily see it as something that's a bit less certain in its outcome than something that's artificially engineered. So I think this is a major problem with nature-based solutions. I don't know how to tackle it, but I agree it would have been top. I would suggest if it was in the survey. So thanks for that.
That's great. Okay, there's another question by Priscilla. What advice would you give for early career scientists who want to contribute for policy change, but feel that the contribution is too small?
I would advise you to look for and take opportunities to do short-term internships in policy organizations like government departments and work with people who are in policy, because then you see it from the inside and you have a much better understanding of how it works. And you also then know people who you know for the rest of your career. So that would be my advice. And in Britain, we have lots of opportunities like that through the training programs for postgraduate researchers. I would expect that there are similar opportunities in other countries. There are internship opportunities in the European Union. So if it's part of if you're doing a PhD and there's an opportunity to take some time out and go and work in Brussels or in the government, then take that opportunity.
Okay, we are running out of time, and I think we should move to the next presentation. Lynn, there's a few questions. I think
I'll try and answer them in writing, shall I?
That would be great. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay, we can go to the next presentation, and this is the presentation now by Anna. Am I correct? Yes, by Anna.
Yes, yes. Can you hear me, guys?
We can hear you well, Anna.
Yes.
Yes. You can share your screen, Anna.
Too many icons, I know. So can you see my presentation now?
Yes.
Good. So first I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Anna, and you were seeing me in the top or the right section in the past 3 days. This is because I'm part of the ReNature Consortium, and I'm dealing mostly with the communication and dissemination of results of the project. So this is why today I'm going to present to you how to properly communicate key messages about nature-based solutions, and not only. What are the benefits, risks, and some best practices, tips and tricks. My talk will be rather trying to address all different target groups, because mostly when you communicate, you sometimes don't know who exactly are you trying to reach, and we're trying to reach both policymakers, industry leaders, and the general public. So why do we communicate science in the first place? Scientists in the past years have established ways to communicate with other scientists quite well, but I have the feeling that they've been forgetting the policymakers, industry leaders, and the general public. And in the world that we live, full with information overload, often results are not very accessible or easily accessible to the general public and other important parties. And this does not mean that they do not want to be educated and enriched and empowered by scientific results. It's just that they're lacking time. So we'll have to find a way to access them in the most useful and valuable way. So I've tried to summarize 10 golden rules on how to do that. As you know, communication is an extremely broad field. So feel free to add some golden rules if you think of such in the question section, and then we can discuss them after my presentation. So first of all, we start with the basics. When you're trying to communicate, think of what's your objective, who you're trying to address, and what's the key message you're trying to deliver. This prevents you from being all over the place and makes your communication message quite concise and on point. Number 2 would be to keep the right profile. You have to find the right tone of voice, which is a combination of being a serious one and an engaging one. And another very useful golden rule is to make use of the power of groups. Recent statistics show from July 2020 show that now more than half of the world is on social media. It's 3.96 billion people across the planet. And if you exclude the people that are not yet eligible to be on social media, between 0 and 14 years old, you can calculate this is actually 2/3 of the world that is eligible to be on social media that actually has subscribed to at least one social media channel. So think of how many people you can reach by just being online. Don't hesitate to engage with audiences that are important to you. Find policymakers on social media and follow them. This way, you are very likely to be followed back, and you're very likely to reach out to them with your social media content. Another golden rule, actually another 3 golden rules that are very linked to each other, is to emphasize solutions and benefits rather than problems, because it's proven that people prefer positive messages rather than negative ones. Of course, you can't skip the negative ones, but try to emphasize on the positive ones. I have given here some examples. Number 2 would be to explain results with examples and connect nature issues with issues that matter to your audience. Maybe not everyone in the general public cares about climate change, but they most definitely care about things that happen to them on a daily basis, whether nature-based solutions save energy, whether they reduce noise, for example, or what benefits nature-based solutions have in their everyday life. One rule that I will be mentioning a couple of times during my presentation is to think visual. Nowadays, we need to always use images, videos, and stories to illustrate what we want to say. Even an emoji is better than nothing on social media. So we should always try to engage the audience with visual content, because it makes it much more likely for them to stop on our social media post and read it, rather than just scroll among a billion other contents. Something that we actually mentioned yesterday, I'll pick from there. We had in the Q&A session, in one of the Q&A sessions, we had this discussion about high impact factors and publishing there, whether this is a guarantee that you'll be cited. And one of the outcomes of discussion was that we have to mix traditional with novel communication methods and actually make a communication mix of tools. Well, this means that if you, for example, have a research paper, you tweet about it, and you create a visual abstract, which would be some graphic, infographic, or something like this. This is actually what can guarantee you a successful distribution of your result. Another golden rule would be to go live. This is something that we are at the moment doing. Luckily, we are sharing our training on YouTube. And I'll give you another example. It's much more impactful if you go live during your field work or while you submit your paper. So you let people be part of your experience. Let them feel as if they're there, especially in times where we're not meeting for conference and we have limited access to people actually. And last but not least, find time for evaluation. It's worth it. Nowadays, social media provides metrics and analytics for free. So you can go anytime in your social media channel and see who your audience is. You can check who is following you, whether you have policymakers in your audience, whether you have students, researchers, and you can adapt your content according to the statistics. So now that I've been talking a lot about visual content, I would like to go into detail with tips and tricks about creating videos. So first one will be to grasp the attention of the audience from the start. When you create a video, keep in mind that people do not watch more than 3 to 5 seconds if they're not interested in what you're trying to say. So try to grasp the attention with the most interesting thing that you want to deliver at the very beginning of your video. Connect with your audience. What are they interested in? What do they care about? This is something that you have to do before you record your video so that you are actually addressing your audience in a proper way. Keep it concise is a very important tip as well, because studies say that people do not watch more than 2 minutes of videos on social media. And this is actually an extreme case, with most people saying that they watch about 40 seconds of videos because they just lack time. Another thing is that Facebook algorithms give preference to visual communication. which means that you have Facebook as a platform that gives you an opportunity to distribute your video quite well, because a post with a video in it boosts your post higher in the or further in the notification list of your audience. And number 5 will be to be aware of the perception of your videos on social media. So try to skip extreme content, because you never know how this will be perceived. Why social media? Actually, because I've been mentioning in all my examples, social media posts, Facebook, Twitter, and so on. Do you think that there is a relation between the popularity of an article on Twitter and the chances gets to be cited? You probably think that there is some kind of a correlation, but I'm going to show you what it is actually. Highly tweeted articles are 11 times more likely to be highly cited, which means that tweeting your articles increases their popularity extremely. This is why I'm going to go into detail about Twitter and Facebook, which are the most popular, at least in Europe, platforms for distributing research among the general public, of course. So keep posts neat and simple. Twitter allows you up to 280 characters, but my advice is to actually use even less and try to explain what you're trying to say in 1 or 2 sentences, simple ones, and of course include some visual content. Hashtags are something that you can search by in Twitter. So adding a hashtag, for example, nature-based solutions, makes your tweets also accessible to people who do not follow you, because they can search for this hashtag and they will find your post, even if they're not your followers. The use of images are something that I wanted to highlight here once again, so you don't forget it. Choose the voice of your account and stick to it. This is also something that I have mentioned already, but it's very important that throughout your whole communication on Twitter, you are consistent in your tone of voice. The regularity of posting is also something very important. Try posting at least once a day or retweeting someone else's content. There are different researches about the timing of posts, and I purposefully decided not to give you some time slots, like for example, Tuesday or Wednesday, because it really depends on who you're trying to reach. Are you trying to reach out to students? Then think of when is the time that they're free and they're on social media. When is the time that policymakers would be on social media, and so on. There are a lot of statistics on the internet that you can quickly Google and find out when the audience that you're interested in is mostly active on social media. And shortly also about Facebook. Facebook provides you a platform for giving some more background to your story. You can use a paragraph or 2, you can write a paragraph or 2 in an engaging way and use this extended amount of symbols to give some detail about what you're trying to communicate. You can also add links to Facebook. You can add links to your research, to your videos, to basically anything that you have created as an information source. Be interactive. Ask questions when you post some content. Try to get to know your audience and know what they think about it. Try to get them to react. You know, Facebook newly invented this reaction, so try to see what people think about your video. Do they are they shocked by it? Do they like it? Do they love it? And so on. They can also comment and share. Make sure you look at those comments, you take a look at who shares, and you know your audience better. Try to also inspect what posts are the most liked ones and why. Now there's something that I specifically researched about and added here because of the science policy context of our training these past 3 days. This is also something that we picked up also in Lynn's presentation, and especially during the poll, we mentioned that bad communication is one of the reasons why inputs are not being taken up by policymakers. So this is why I decided to give you a glimpse of what the structure of a so-called policy brief is. This is the means of communication to policymakers, and it has to be a concise summary of information, much more concise than, for example, a paper. And one very important thing about it that you have to remember, the reader is a non-specialist. As we saw also during Lynn's presentation, the background of a policymaker is often not an environment whatsoever. So the structure of a policy brief has to be quite concise. The title has to be informative and catchy. We should definitely give relevance to legislation. So let people know what is the relationship between what we are trying to say and between what they know. So give them context. What are the EU directives that you're relating to? And of course, we have to have very concise policy recommendations that are very concrete, that, for example, feature information like this amount of money is needed to solve our problem, which we have explained in a section before. Writing a policy brief is actually quite a difficult task compared to writing a social media post or something like this, because you really have to base it on research, on legislation, on policies, on directives, in order to make it impactful to a policymaker. So I've been talking a lot about visual communication. So this is why I wanted to present to you types of powerful communication tools. One of these would be infographics. Here you can see one infographic about nature-based solutions that manages, in just a glimpse, to give you a perspective of who is involved, what societal challenges are addressed, and is actually much more on point than reading a full paper of, for example, 10 pages. Another powerful tool that is now gaining popularity are 3D videos and models. Here you can see, this is a video on nature-based solutions, on climate issues as well, and nature-based solutions is one of it. It's jumping from one topic to another, but with these 3D effects, it grabs the user's attention quite well. Another topic, another powerful tool is the animated videos. You can see that this one has 4 million views. I'm pretty sure that if this was just a talk between researchers and experts, just interviews, it would have been much less viewed, and it would capture much less attention, or at least not the attention of the general public. Another powerful tool are comics. This one is especially on nature-based solutions, and it requires more time than a simpler infographic, but it still manages to deliver a lot of content in just one picture. So all these things look great, but I would like to give you some very easy access on how to create them by yourself. Here you can see a selection of 5 websites where you can freely access and experiment with creating such infographics, postcards, videos, and so on for free. They also have a paid version, but these are the 5, at least, that I chose, 5 best for me that you can use, and they offer quite a lot of options also in the free version. And last but not least, I would like to present a very, very recent communication method of ReNature, and this is our RIO collection. RIO is a journal, it's called Research Ideas and Outcomes. And by very new, I mean we have submitted and created yesterday a project collection with the name of the project. And as open access, open science in general is a key pillar in ReNature, we decided to openly share our training materials as well as other research outputs, like the project compendium that you can see on our website. We have just started and will continue to promote open innovation by sharing our own progress. We have already planned the first few papers, which will include presentations from previous trainings and this training as well. And I have actually submitted the introductory article right before our call today. So I'm very excited and I'm going to tweet about it, of course. Follow us on Twitter to find more about this. And to be up to date with all of our articles one by one as they come. So thank you very much for listening. And this is my email in case you have any questions. In case you would like to ask me any questions about communicating science and other best practices about social media and general communication. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, for this presentation. Thank you for identifying golden rules for interacting on social media, for disseminating knowledge. I think this is crucial, and I think from Lynn's poll and also from the article she was showing this morning, you realize that there's so much that we need to work on in terms of communication. You know, I mean, there's a saying in Maltese. I won't say it in Maltese because the few people will understand, but basically the meaning of it is showcasing what you are doing is as good as what you are doing, you know. And if you don't showcase what you are doing, then what's the point of it? I mean, it's just it's research which stays there on a shelf potentially and not being taken up and used in policy and practice and so on. So there's a couple of questions for Anna, and Emily is asking about LinkedIn. What about LinkedIn? Many things are being shared there. It's a professional network, as you will know.
Yeah, I'm actually very glad. I'm actually very glad you're asking this question because LinkedIn is gaining more and more popularity. It started off as a platform for recruitment and just looking for jobs, but nowadays it's actually a place when you can reach out to a lot of businesses as well. So the more your project is linked to business or is trying to link to business, the more relevant it is for your project or for you as a researcher to be on LinkedIn. We can actually consider this for ReNature as well. Now that we are more than halfway into the project, we can create a LinkedIn profile and share already existing results there as well.
Okay, Anna, the next question is about the Rio collection. I'm sorry. There's a link, of course, to the journal, which I'm going to type in the Q&A section for Roizen. But is there a link to the introductory article of our collection?
Our introductory article is currently going under technical review, so it still does not appear as officially published. This is why please stay tuned on Twitter, on the website, everywhere. We're going to post a lot about this collection. I can give you the title already, which you can search. I will type it in the here in the chat. You can search the collection, but it will only appear after the first article has undergone technical review and is officially published.
Excellent. Thank you very much. As a side note about this special issue, it's basically a way of sharing the knowledge we have created and co-created in this ReNature project. It will include training material from the ReNature 5 training courses and also from the summer school, which was held last year in Malta in September, October. It will include some deliverables. For example, one thing we are including in the Rio collection is the technical report about the ReNature compendium, so how it has been created, the literature we have used to create it, the interaction we have had with our stakeholders. And it will continue to be developed. So the next question was about the presentations, and I have seen this question a few times over the past few days. The answer is that all the presentations have been live streamed on YouTube, so they are already out there. The slides for the presentation, it really depends on the speaker, but one thing which we normally do after each training course is ask the speakers if they would like to share the presentations and if they would like to include them in our Rio collection. And then it becomes available after a short while. But meanwhile, all the presentations are available online via YouTube in the ReNature project account, basically. And it's being live streamed there at the moment. Okay, I think there's a comment from Philippa. How are we in terms of timing? So it's 11:09 and our break should have been, normally it should have been. Jane should be starting at 11:30, so we still have 5 minutes. Anna, you may want to take some of these questions. There's a question by Philippa. Wonderful. Thank you for your clear, insightful advice, Anna. How important is it to include Twitter in the mix along with Facebook, email, LinkedIn, etc.? My teenagers show me so many platforms, but I'm keen to simplify my life.
Yeah, this is a great question because there are indeed many platforms out there. I purposefully decided to present more detail on Facebook and Twitter because I myself consider them the most relevant ones. Of course, it really depends on your research, as I mentioned. So it depends on your target group. If you think that business is very important for you and industry leaders are very important for you, then you should definitely go on LinkedIn as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Anna. I agree with that. For example, locally, I don't think Twitter has you have a very large audience from Malta, for example, in our case, on Twitter, but Facebook is the social media platform that is mostly used, and Instagram, apparently. So it really depends on the audience.
And actually, yeah, Twitter might not be very popular in Malta, but we are very popular on Twitter. So apparently, we have reached out to the EU or the world in general. So even if a social media channel is not very popular in your country, this doesn't mean that you should decide to skip it, because in this way you would also skip big parts of the world as well.
Excellent advice, Anna. Thank you very much. The chat will remain open. We've answered most of the questions, I believe. There's still some open questions for Lynn and for Anna, I guess, as well. If you would like to tackle those here or even in the chat, Lynn and Anna, please let me know. Of course, in the chat, please go ahead. I think we should stop now for a break, and we'll come back at 11:30 with Jane's presentation. So our last presentation of the training course. But last but not least, Jane has been doing a lot of work for pollinators. We have worked together in other projects as well, Jane, for 6 years, I think, from Super Bee, something like that, Lynn as well. So yes, I'm looking forward to your presentation, Jane, in 15 minutes more or less. Okay, see you later. Eileen, we start at 11:30. I think we can already launch the next poll. So we're launching the polls we've been launching over the past 2 days. Basically, we're trying to get to know our training course participants. We want to know from where you're coming from. And I'm taking the opportunity now that we're on break to launch this poll. We will have other polls until the end of the training course today.
I would just like to say that for the people who are watching on YouTube, they just got to watch me drinking my coffee for quite a while before I realised. Sorry for that. I should be better equipped to deal with the technology.
Maybe we can add some screenshots to the ReNature website, Lynn.
Little mini videos would be good. Yeah.
Have you ever seen? There's a site called Napflix, and it basically you can watch things for hours and hours. There's one which has Matthew McConaughey watching rain for maybe 2 or 3 hours, just sitting there looking, staring at something, and counting sheep and just watching rain.
Maybe there's actually money to be made out of the little clips.
Yeah, we could sell it to Netflix. There, Lynn drinking coffee for the next.
Coffee, working, checking emails.
I can make something.
It took me quite a while, so I went to look at the YouTube and I was like, why is there just me on there? Stupid.
You could do one for your kids, like you pretending to be interested in what they're saying, just going yeah, oh really,
oh, yeah,
oh yeah, and just keep repeating it, and they'll just
yeah, they love it, I'm sure.
Mom's really taking an interest in our work. Yeah, really.
Hi guys.
Hi David.
Hi, David.
I was in the classroom until now.
Ah,
But
welcome.
It looks like I missed something interesting, judging from your conversation.
You did. Not just Lynn and her coffee.
I'll go through it on YouTube.
Yeah, it's all on YouTube.
The chat isn't on YouTube though, is it? The people watching on YouTube won't be able to see all the questions.
I don't think so. I don't think so. But we do have a recording of everything, and it's being recorded. And if you want, maybe if we're going to put this on the ReNature website, we could put the official recording that we are using here. I'm not sure exactly what is included in the recording, but I know that the chat becomes available there. Okay, so I think all the panelists are here. Jane is here and ready to start. Jane will be talking about pollinators, but not just pollinators, the All Ireland Pollinator Plan. So it's an effective and a good example of the link between the science and policy. So Jane, it's your own. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I shared my screen there now. Do you all see that?
Yes.
Great. Okay, thanks very much. It's a great pleasure to be talking to you this morning. I'm talking about science and policy for pollinator protection, and I'm going to tell you the story of the All Ireland Pollinator Plan and where we came from and what it's doing. But I guess just to begin with, to introduce myself to you, I'm an ecologist. My research spans a whole range of areas, some of them indicated here in the word cloud. But basically, I'm very much interested in the interactions between people and nature, particularly between bees. That's been my study organism for the last 20 odd years, and other pollinators. But this link between ecology and ecological interactions and the science of ecology and people and human society. So I've added my contact details in there, and feel free to get in touch with me. So today what I want to talk to you about is how we went about creating the pollinator plan here in Ireland, some policy and positive solutions for pollinators in Ireland. And just to introduce you to Ireland's nature, Ireland is an island at the western edge of Europe. For those of you that are joining us from all around the world, this is where we are. And our nature is a product of our geographical location and the climate, and the fact until about 13,000 years ago we were covered in ice. So what we have now in terms of our nature is a result of glacial processes, the plants and animals that recolonized until the land bridge was cut off about 7,500 years ago, and a long history of human activity on the island. And we have some stunning habitats and species from coastal grasslands, upland bogs and heaths, wonderful range of flora and fauna within these habitats. And our mild, moist Atlantic climate and diversity of lakes and rivers and bedrocks means that we get some unusual combinations of species. And so we get some unusual combinations, particularly in the west, of Arctic species with Atlantic species. In total, we have about 31,500 different species living in 117 habitats. So that's the kind of the crude overview of Ireland's biodiversity. And Ireland is really well known for its lush green rolling hills, and here's an image of a typical Irish landscape. But our biodiversity is under threat. It's under threat from agricultural intensification on the one hand, and abandonment on the other hand, from urbanization, from pollution, climate change, invasive species, all of the things that are threatening nature all over the world. 85% of the habitats in Ireland that have official policy protection are in unfavourable conditions. So when we talk about the state of nature in Ireland, we can look at our protected habitats and see how well those policies for environmental protection are doing, and they're not doing very well. 85% in unfavourable condition, and as Lynn mentioned earlier on, this does result in Ireland being fined for not maintaining habitats in appropriate condition for conservation of species under the Habitats Directive and associated policies. So that's about our protected areas and how policy is influencing nature in Ireland, not doing particularly well. But actually most of Ireland isn't protected. 64% of the land area in Ireland is dedicated to agriculture. It's mostly improved grassland, and you see here this map of Europe which shows the land cover of different European countries. Red is high percentage of grassland, and Ireland is basically all red. It's a lot of grassland. And within these agricultural grasslands, obviously there are patches of wild habitat, semi-natural habitat, but not very big patches. So between 6 and 41% of farm area would be semi-natural habitat patches. Those farms with higher proportions of semi-natural habitat tend to occur in the more extensive farms in the west of Ireland. But some of these semi-natural habitat patches on farmland aren't afforded any kind of protection under agricultural policies. So we talked about protected areas and Habitats Directive. There's also agricultural policies, and up to 27% of these habitat patches on farms are undervalued by policy. They're not protected by any kind of agricultural policy. So the point that I'm making here is that we have a policy problem with regards to habitats in Ireland, because we have our protected habitats are in unfavourable condition, and large proportions of our farmed habitats are not considered of any value, so are not afforded any protection under agricultural policy. What about at the species level? Well, I said we had about 31,500 species in Ireland. In terms of what we know about the conservation status of most of them is not very much. Only about 10% of species have been assessed. So we actually have a fundamental knowledge gap in how our biodiversity is changing. But of course, if we've got a problem with our habitats, if we're losing habitats, losing habitat quality, then we're probably losing the species that live there. And of the species that have been assessed, as I say, about 10% have been assessed for conservation status. 1 in every 5th species is threatened with extinction here. So we have this high proportion of species that are extinction risk. Now, as I mentioned at the start, my interest is particularly in bees and other pollinators, and the decline of bees and pollinators in general has been recognised all over the world, and it's something that has been fairly high profile. In terms of Ireland, of our 99 bee species, so we have 1 honeybee, 21 bumblebees and 77 solitary bees, a relatively depauperate bee fauna in comparison to the rest of Europe. We have assessed the conservation status of these bees and found that about 1/3 of these species are at risk of extinction. That's a high proportion. 30% of our species are officially at extinction risk. In terms of protection for these at-risk species, the legal protection for species comes from the Habitats Directive, and the only protected species in Ireland, the only protected insect species in Ireland, sorry, is the marsh fritillary butterfly. So this is an Annex 2 species protected by the EU Habitats Directive. So our conservation policy isn't necessarily helping those species that are at risk. And on farmland, our agri-environmental policy, there are schemes, specific schemes for nesting bees, so provision of solitary bee hotels and sand piles. But actually, these won't protect most bee species, they won't help most bee species. And the sand piles can be a complete waste of money in many cases. So we have a problem. We have degradation of habitats, we have loss of species, decline of species, and the official policy responses, the Habitats Directives, the agri-environment schemes, aren't particularly effective. We have this problem in terms of conservation of our biodiversity. So what do we do about this? And in terms of pollinators in particular, why should pollinator decline matter? Why would a policymaker care? And this harks back to what Lynn mentioned in terms of making conservation issues relevant to policymakers. Why should they care that pollinator decline matters? Well, we need to make a case, and that's where the science come in. And it's well known that a high proportion of crop species worldwide are animal pollinated, and almost every justification for conservation of pollinators comes from the idea that they are important to our food supply. So pollinators are important for contributing to the production of crops, for production of food, for fruits and vegetables, for nutrition, for food security, for dietary choice, etc., etc. So there's a lot of good arguments that can be made in terms of pollinator conservation for food production. But in Ireland, we don't produce many insect pollinated foods. 64% of our island is covered in grass for livestock. We grow very few insect dependent crops. So apples, strawberries, blackcurrants, raspberries would be really the main ones, but this is over a relatively small area and a relatively small portion of the agricultural production. It does have an economic value. So one of the ways that conservation of pollinators has been justified globally has been because of the production of food and the contribution that this makes to the economy. So if we look at the animal pollinated crops in Ireland and the contribution of pollination to the financial gain from those animal pollinated crops, we can look at dependency ratios and we can estimate, and we just did this recent estimate that pollination contributes nearly 60 million per year to food crop production. And that, that sounds like a lot of money, 60 million euro, but it's relatively small in comparison to other aspects of the economy. So it's hard to make this argument in Ireland that we need to conserve pollinators because they're important for crops. And also these crops, apples, strawberries, blackcurrants, raspberries, can be pollinated by managed pollinators, by honeybees, by bumblebees. Why do we need to conserve the diversity of wild bees? Why do we need to protect that whole suite of pollinator species, those 99 species of bees? Why can we not just manage honeybees and bumblebees and rely on those for our crop pollination? Well, there's lots of evidence that pollinator diversity is important, that we need to maintain diversity. And two recent pieces of evidence I'll just show you here that it's important to maintain diversity of pollinators even for these farm cropping systems. So in this graph here, you can see the relationship from a global study that looked at a whole range of different farming systems, looked at how the relationship between species richness, so the number of different species in the system, and the delivery of the service. And on the left, we have pollination service, and on the right, we have the biocontrol, so natural pest control service. And in both cases, through all of these studies across the globe, we see that if we have an increase in the number of species, you get an increase in the provision of this service. So this is showing that diversity matters, that if you have more species, then you have an increase in the delivery of the service. And another piece of evidence, again from a global meta-analysis, was looking at diversity of types of pollinators. So if you have different types of pollinators, these have different traits, different body size, different tongue length, different behavior, different activity windows through the year, different activity periods through the day, etc. And all these different traits can maximize yield, again, across a range of crops. And there's countless studies that have shown that diversity gives us resilience from year to year to bounce back from perturbations, and that diversity improves ecological functioning across many systems, which is necessary for healthy ecosystems. So we know that not only do we need pollinators to support crop production, but that a diversity of pollinators can be important for maximizing that crop production. But it's not all about crops. So beyond crops, pollination is important ecologically. So it's important across the ecosystem. So for example, we look at our rolling green hills in Ireland. A good proportion of those species are animal pollinated. And so this means that animal pollinators contribute to ecosystems, for example, providing the fruit and the seeds for farmland birds and other animals to survive, for the maintenance of plant communities that then influence things like carbon storage and nutrient cycling, for influencing, for example, insect pollinators are important for maintaining populations of nitrogen fixing legumes, etc., etc. So pollinators don't just have this crop value. So when we think about what the value of pollination services are, yes, 75% of crop species worldwide are animal pollinated, and that is a very good and important argument for implementing policy to conserve pollinators, but it's not just about crops. So 87.5% of flowering wild plant species worldwide are animal pollinated or benefit to some extent from animal pollination. So there's a huge range of benefits that we get from animal pollination for utilitarian, ecological existence and future viewpoints. So pollinators can have a direct use value in terms of their contribution to crop production, as I just said, and we can put financial figures on this. But pollinators also have a direct use value for things that aren't bought and sold on the market. For example, medicinal plants or wild foraged berries. Or they make up landscapes that we directly use for recreation. And they also contribute indirectly to things we use. They contribute to ecosystem function, as I just mentioned, including resilience to change, nutrient cycling, soils, etc. And then there's lots of values associated with us not using pollinators in their services. They might not be of any use to us right now, but they give us the potential to do something different in the future. If we have different climates, if we want to grow different crops, if we need to cope with different environments. This means that we have options, this future potential. And just the existence of a range of pollinators is of value to some people. You know, there's 20,000 different species of bee worldwide. I'll never see them all in my lifetime or use anything they contribute to, but I will get satisfaction from knowing that they exist. And finally, there's the moral, the bequest value of pollinators. We have an obligation to future generations to leave nature for them. And so all of these arguments about why pollinators are important are what we need to justify the policy for their protection. The evidence base for their importance comes from the science. And then that can help us communicate with the policymakers in terms of trying to implement policy to protect pollinators. So what kind of policies do we need? Well, if pollinators are being driven by human activities into decline, then we need to reverse those drivers of decline. And there's been a wealth of scientific research over the past couple of decades on what's driving decline in bees and other pollinators. And I've sort of summarized them here in 5 points. And really the loss of semi-natural habitats and the associated loss in food plants has meant that we've got habitat loss leading to homelessness. So there aren't places for pollinators to live, a decline in wildflowers, which means that there's hunger. Pests and diseases are causing sickness. We know from our own current situation that emergent diseases can be disastrous for populations. Exposure to pesticides and other chemicals in the environment can lead to poisoning and can lead to influencing the availability of food, resources, and also there's a gradual changing environment through climate change and the increased frequency of storms, floods, droughts, wildfires, all these kind of things. And it's thought that these drivers and a combination of these drivers is making things worse for pollinators. You know, maybe a bee can sick with being a bee could cope with being sick as long as it's got enough food, or it could cope with a monotonous monofloral diet as long as that diet isn't contaminated with chemicals. So this is what we know in general from many scientific pieces of scientific research from all over the world. And what we're trying to do in my research group, and what each individual PhD student, each individual piece of research is doing, is trying to understand the specifics of these drivers of decline. So we need to understand, you know, in terms of wildflowers, in terms of implementing policy to increase wildflowers in the landscape, do we just need more wildflowers, or do we need more of a particular type, or do we need diversity? What resources do different species need? How do different plant species differ in terms of the nutritional value of their nectar and pollen? How much of that is contaminated with pesticides? How does it change through the year? How does it change in the landscape? And some of the projects that we're working on in my group now are addressing these questions, and the pictures here are of some of my current research group in the field. So it's important that these little pieces of research are undertaken in order to inform or guide the actions that need to be taken on the ground in particular locations. And without knowing all of this, it's hard to implement the policy to reverse pollinator decline. So once we have the science, once we have the evidence base, that's when we can start to inform policy. So that's what we did. So in Ireland, we took the science of understanding the decline in bees. So there was a red list process we went through in 2006, and a red list for bees published in 2006. And this is where we get our statistic of 1/3 of Irish bee species being at risk of extinction. We take this evidence, our understanding of the importance of pollinators, not just for crop pollination, but for the wider importance of pollinators in ecological systems and in our own society. And our understanding of the drivers of what's causing decline. And we took this scientific evidence and put it together in a multi-sectoral action plan. And the picture there is of myself and Una Fitzpatrick, who's senior ecologist at the National Biodiversity Data Centre. And I think about more than 10 years ago, the two of us sat down and said, we need to do something about this. What can we do? And of course, we were deep in a global recession at the time. And there wasn't really the appetite for it. So what we did is we hung on to things until about 2014. As Lynn mentioned earlier, the English pollinator strategy was happening at the same time. There was international interest in creating pollinator strategies. And so we capitalized on that. We capitalized on the fact people were more interested in pollinator decline, and we kind of hit that window of opportunity. So the All Ireland Pollinator Plan was developed by a multi-sectoral steering group, and it was published in 2015, and we listed 81 actions under 5 key areas. And it was really about creating habitat, so making Ireland more pollinator friendly, renaturing Ireland in terms of farmland, public land and private land, raising awareness of pollinators and how important it is to protect them. So to create that environment in which policy makers are maybe then more open to developing policy around pollinators. looking at managed bees, so supporting beekeepers and growers, expanding our knowledge on pollinators and pollination service, so continuing doing the research, continuing with the science to make sure that what we're doing is the best and is evidence-based. And tracking change, so collecting evidence to track what's happening in terms of change on the ground and to be able to measure success. So it's success in terms of implementation of action, but also success in terms of reversing pollinator decline, which was the key target. We had 68 governmental and non-governmental organisations who signed up to implement the actions in the plan. So we listed these 81 actions, and we got people to actually sign up next to each one and say, yes, we'll implement that. We'll take that action. And so at its core, the plan is really about looking at the whole landscape. So farmland, public land, private land, and trying to make a place where pollinators can thrive and survive. So the approach of the plan has been very much bottom-up, cross-sectoral and collaborative, and collaboration was really, really key for us. So the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland are working together to share our knowledge, experience, resources to address the problem. As Lynn mentioned, the devolved administration in the UK meant that it was useful and important to us that we took an all-Ireland approach between the Republic and Northern Ireland, so that the bees don't know where the border is. So we wanted to make sure that we were taking action in a coherent way. We had no funding for this. So our partners, I mentioned those 68 organisations initially, we now have more than 100 partners. They're funding their own actions. And so we integrated existing networks and partnerships and got people on board from a sort of very bottom-up approach. And these pictures here just show, this is one of the existing networks that we got involved with, is a Tidy Towns, a community-based network. So here local communities come together with the ambition of tidying their towns, but also improving their towns in terms of wildlife. And we instigated a pollinator award. And so you get the local community to take ownership of implementing pollinator-friendly management. So this collaborative and network approach was really important for us. The other thing that we've done as part of the approach through the All Ireland Pollinator Plan, and the question we got asked the most was, what should we do? So with the local communities, they want to get involved, but they don't know what to do. What do we do? Gardeners want to garden in a more pollinator-friendly way. What can they do? So we've produced this, we've developed and published this range of guidelines targeted to different sectors. So each of these guidelines, you can see we've guidelines there for gardens, for councils, for businesses, for local communities, on farmland, for transport corridors. We've got technical guidelines for how to create wildflower meadows, how to create nesting space. We've just, one of the most recent guidelines we did was in terms of using managed bumblebees in horticulture. And we've got specific guidelines for specific groups, for group water schemes on golf courses, and we're just in the final stages of developing guidelines for sporting organisations. And the idea of these guidelines is that they contain lots of actions, each of them explained, and that there's lots of options. And I think that's important, is there's no one way to solve the problem. There's lots of options, and so what we wanted to do was give people a choice of what suited them. A lot of actions are very pragmatic, they're low cost, and all of these materials are available and free for download on our website. And I think, for me as a scientist, the really important thing was these are evidence-based. So we are taking evidence for what works, what doesn't work. If we don't have the evidence from Ireland, we've used evidence from nearby, but we continue building that evidence base, and we'll continue to revise these guidelines. And the other part of our approach was really, and this is what Anna just mentioned, is positive messaging. It's all too easy, and I did it in this presentation, start by saying, you know, everything's terrible, we're losing biodiversity, pollinators are in decline, it's awful. You know, turn that around, use the positive messaging, celebrate what we have, and also using bees as a vehicle for wider biodiversity. People have got engaged and on board with the idea that bees are important, useful aspects of ecosystems, so we can use those as a vehicle for restoration of habitat that then provides a lot more ecosystem services. We're also celebrating best practice, and some of the pictures here you can see are of these pollinator awards I mentioned through the Tidy Towns. We also have our pollinator champions. We have school children and involved and local communities. And so it's really important that people feel they're part of something, and that they're not isolated in the efforts that they're making. So, you know, I've got the text there, together we can make a difference. And each person, by doing something individually, feels like they're not actually contributing. But if each person individually feels part of a bigger effort, then that can help people to stay motivated to continue to implement positive action. And then in terms of our approach, the other thing that we've tried to do is keep the messages simple and keep our branding simple and use a range of communications approaches. And again, as Anna mentioned earlier, there's lots of different ways to reach different audiences. And because we wanted this plan to hit audiences across the whole spectrum, we needed a range of communications approaches. So we have our website, pollinators.ie, where all of the materials are free to download. We're on Twitter. We've only recently joined Twitter, so we're relatively new to Twitter. But we have a blog series, and we've done lots and lots of awareness raising activities and events. So in the bottom left-hand corner there, we have this animation, and I've put the link there. I'll share the link in the chat. This animation, as Anna said, it's short, it's easy to understand, and we've done various other videos and technical videos that are available on the website. The photograph in the middle at the bottom there is from a festival last September, and that's our president. That's President Higgins, the Irish president, in the picture, along with some of my research group, and we were there talking about the research that we were doing and talking about how that fed into the pollinator plan. And then on the right hand side there, the picture there with the sea and the sign in the grass on the cliff edge there overlooking the sea, that's actually really near my house, and I was so proud and delighted to see that sign go up on the top of Braehead there, with our branding, with our logo, to say that this area is managed for wildlife, and our signs say managed for wildlife, not just managed for pollinators, because the benefits of managing for pollinators can spill over into other wildlife. So all of our messaging is simple, it's all branded with our logo, and everything is free to download. So we've used this range of communications approaches. And in terms of the successes, I don't think in 2015, when we launched this, we ever thought we'd be so successful. I mean, we launched it, Una and I wrote a press release and put it out there and just, you know, waited to see what would happen. It's incredible success. People are taking action for pollinators across the length and the breadth of Ireland and across sectors. So the map here is from a mapping system on actions for pollinators. And we can see that there's there's about 4,000 actions that have been logged, covering more than 3,000 square kilometres, which is about 5% of the land surface of Ireland. And we know that this actually is a huge underestimate, because an awful lot of people are taking action but not logging it on the system. But there's a lot of action, and it's happening all over the place. And so just some of our key successes, we've reached all 3,200 primary schools in the Republic of Ireland by teaming up with a supermarket chain here and having a promotional campaign, and they've sent materials to all the primary schools. Half of our councils have formally partnered and agreed to take action. So we have this, councils, local authorities can sign up to become official partners to the plan. We have 162 local communities that have become pollinator friendly through this Tidy Towns, again, partnering with an existing and ongoing network of people. We have business supporters. The number of business supporters now stands at more than 260, and this incorporates small businesses, honey producers, soap makers, small local businesses, all the way up to the national and the international businesses that are signed up to take action for pollinators. And policy. So when we started, as I said, this was a bottom-up voluntary process. So as opposed to the process in the UK that Lynn described, where the government wanted to create a pollinator strategy, we started a pollinator strategy, and then it got into our national policy. So it's now in the National Biodiversity Action Plan. One of the actions, 4.1.8, is to implement the All Ireland Pollinator Plan. So we've kind of gone around this in an unusual way, I suppose. So we created the pollinator plan, which raised the profile, which then got it into policy. So it's kind of the other way around to how it's happened in a lot of other places. And we've joined global efforts. So we've, through instigating the All Ireland Pollinator Plan, we were then able to join the global coalition for the willing on pollinators, promote pollinators, and we're very much involved in the EU Pollinator Initiative and the International Pollinator Initiative. So by taking this small scale local action, by bringing it together, we have then been able to scale out and up. So in the short term, we got buy-in. So lots of people from across lots of sectors are doing something positive for pollinators. So this pie chart here shows different sectors and the number of sites that are being managed in a pollinator friendly way. So this is from our mapping system, from the Actions for Pollinators system. And we can see there, and I'm trying to figure out what the biggest chunk is there. The local communities is the light blue. The biggest chunk of sites, and gardens is the pink, another large sector of contributions. So we've got buy-in, we've got people doing things for pollinators. And in the medium term, this should result in this renaturing, this rewilding that we need, returning food and shelter for pollinators into the Irish landscape. In terms of the long-term outlook for pollinators, it's still hard to say. And in terms of trying to understand whether this actually does reverse pollinator decline, then we need to go back to the science. We need coordinated long-term monitoring, and we need continued efforts. So the first phase of the All Ireland Pollinator Plan, you can see there in the top right-hand corner of the slide, and our logo, we've got 2015 to 2020. Well, here we are in September 2020, what next? And what next is the second phase. So we're developing the second phase of the All Ireland Pollinator Plan, building on the first phase, building on these key successes, building on this collaborative approach, this cross-sectoral approach to try and continue these efforts. And also pollinators may be very trendy now. We kind of need to make the most of that to get some long-term change, not just for pollinators, but for wider biodiversity across landscapes, across urban, across farmed, and across semi-natural landscapes. So to summarize, the science underpins our understanding of the issues. So in this case, the understanding of pollinator decline and how to tackle it. And this helps to make the case for action. So as Lynn was saying earlier, you know, we need the policymakers to be interested, and we need to make the case for them to actually make policies that will help to tackle biodiversity loss. So making the case for action was very important. And the policy gaps, so the gaps that we had in terms of our policies with regards to Habitats Directive and our agri-environment policies, these gaps have kind of been filled with this voluntary bottom-up plan. And so when the policy windows open for revising agri-environment schemes, for building on our protected areas and our protected species, we already have systems in place. We have this participatory approach. We have, we're working with stakeholders across all of these different sectors, and we already have their buy-in. It's important that we do work across sectors. It's not just environmental conservation and agricultural policy that's important. As Lynn mentioned, there's a whole range of sectors for which this is important, you know, in terms of health and well-being, in terms of education, in terms of tourism and recreation. So we need to really tackle this across the board. And from our own experience in the All Ireland Pollinator Plan, this clear evidence-based, science-based guidance is really important for actually implementing the policy. When we launched the plan in 2015 with our 81 actions, you know, we kind of took a sigh of relief. Brilliant, we've launched that now. But of course, that was when the work actually started. The hard work of actually implementing it started. And that's where we need to continue to generate the evidence base. And we need these positive, simple messages that by working together, by everybody doing a little bit, we can together make a difference. So just finally then, of course, none of this would have been possible without the tireless work of the team at the National Biodiversity Data Centre, led by Una Fitzpatrick, and our series of pollinator officers, particularly our current officer, Juanita, who are doing a lot of the sterling on the ground implementation work. So I've left the link there. Pollinators.ie is where all of the resources for the All Ireland Pollinator Plan are available, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane. It's great to see so much participation in this creation and also uptake of this All Ireland Pollinator Plan. There are quite a few questions. I'll start by the simple ones. So Fran says, hi, Jane. Fran.
Hi, Fran.
And then there's Philippa saying, so encouraging, thank you. But she also asks a question. So I know the use of low-key language regarding the benefits of pollinators rather than the ecological crisis that would occur if they vanish from our ecosystems. And the marked loss of pollinators, including commercial bees across Australia last summer from the combination of heat, drought and fires, so climate drivers as essential elements. I'm not sure I understand the last question, Philippa. Sorry, maybe something I haven't understood the first word there. But yes, Jane, maybe.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely, Philippa, that was intentional. You know, this idea, and Lynn mentioned it in her talk earlier, is about this approach of positive messages and talking about the benefits of conservation rather than focusing on the crises and the risks of the loss. I mean, obviously that's important as well, and it is important that anyone in any part of the process, but particularly the pollinators, do understand the risks, but also that the benefits are articulated as well. And I guess it's that kind of articulating the trade-off between those is quite important in terms of getting policymakers on board. So, you know, it's going to cost you this much if you let pollinators go extinct. It's only going to cost you this much, and it's going to have all these benefits if we protect them. So it's important to have both sides of that, I think. And I think the conservation lobby, I suppose the conservationists over the last 20 or 30 years have really been saying, you know, this is all going one way. It's a very negative situation, and you know, flipping it around and talking about the positives are really important. And I think that's what's helped us anyway become successful. But I think more broadly, globally, that's happening as well.
Thank you. So Fran asks, are there rare species that can be promoted using nature-based solutions that we can specifically design in from a technical perspective and contribute to their conservation? It's a great question.
That's a great question, Fran. Yes. I mean, one of the problems with rare species is we often don't know enough about them. So by the very nature of them being rare, they're difficult to study. They also, it can be difficult to know exactly what you need to do for rare species. For some rare species, we know enough about them. We know about the kinds of habitats that they need, the resources they require. Then yes, we can create nature-based solutions specifically focused at those species. So for example, in Ireland, we've released specific guidelines for the great yellow bumblebee, Bombus distinguendus, which is hanging on in tiny populations in the northwest of Ireland. And you know, so we can start to create habitats that they require and that they need. And so, yeah, I mean, improving our understanding of rare species is really key to that.
Okay, Jane, there's some questions which are comments which are really congratulations on your good work and on the excellent presentation.
Thank you.
I'm going to answer those as being answered live, but feel free to get back to these people in the chat. Nika from Malta asks, incredible how many schools, businesses, and local councils have been reached among other stakeholders. How did you achieve such a high reach? Working in Malta with a very small team, we are lucky to engage 10 schools yearly. Excellent.
Yeah, it is incredible. I'm still kind of flabbergasted, to be honest, Nika. Thank you. I think, you know, this participatory approach and this approach of working with already established networks was something that was really important. So, for example, reaching all of the schools happened because we partnered with SuperValue, which is a supermarket chain here in Ireland, and they were keen. They were already sponsoring the Tidy Towns. They were keen to add a pollinator element and to specifically reach out to schools with regards to pollinators, and so, you know, that's how we got out to all of the schools, and we developed particular school guidelines and plans for children, and you translated them into Irish and everything. In terms of reaching the businesses, that one's been amazing. We did launch the business guidelines quite early on, and we had a business policy officer, a business pollinator officer for a few months. I think it was even less than 12 months last year. But they're coming to us. The businesses are coming to us. The businesses want to do something. They're coming to us and signing up. And almost every week we've got new businesses signing up. So it's possible to, and as I say, you know, when we started this, we didn't have any funding. There was myself and Una. We've both got other full-time jobs. You know, it has somehow snowballed, and you know, we're sort of flabbergasted at how that's happened as well, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, and Jane, if I can say something, I think it's also the partnering with NGOs, for example, is really crucial here, because of course you're employed as a scientist, you're employed as a scientist, a full-time professor, so there's limitations in how much you can do this type of work, and I think locally, you know, I work in this field, and for pollinators, we have been working with an NGO, Friends of the Earth. Someone was here this morning, and the work they have done is amazing. They managed to create, for example, with the authorities, with ERA, which is some people from ERA are here with us, seed packets like this, and with a brochure they are sent to anyone who is interested. So yeah. Collaboration, I think, is crucial.
Absolutely,
right?
Key. Yeah, absolutely. Collaboration, and I think, you know, there's already quite a lot going on. When we started, there was already quite a lot of initiatives and people interested in doing something for pollinators. And what the plan has been able to do is to bring that together, and maybe then together we do make more of a difference. But yeah, absolutely, it's been incredible.
Okay, there's another question by Marianne. So we have been working on the pollinator plan here in Dublin City Parks, Biodiversity and Landscape Services, and it has been a good way to gain support for measures we have been trying to do over educate to reduce mowing intensity in areas in public green spaces. We need to have more resources to evaluate performance, success, and in particular for new developments where people propose pollinator beds with no specifics. I think there's more coming, probably, Jane. So there are many initiatives which are ongoing, right? So
yeah, absolutely. And hi, Marianne, and you guys have been doing great work. Yeah, evaluating performance and success is something that's really important, and that's something that's important in the next phase of the pollinator plan. You know, we've put out a lot of guidelines, we've put out lots of advice, lots of people are making changes. What's, you know, is that actually making a difference? And you know, as I said in my talk, you know, understanding which changes, you know, it's not just a case of adding more flowers, it's what types of flowers and what times of year, and you know, those kind of nuances. So I think as we move forward, our conservation strategies can become a little bit more specific and a bit more nuanced, and reach out beyond pollinators. As you say, you know, you've decreased mowing intensity, that doesn't just benefit pollinators, that benefits a whole range of biodiversity and the ecosystem services that are then delivered in those urban areas. So yeah, we'll keep working with you as well, Marianne.
Lynn, yes, go on.
Yeah, I just wanted to point people towards the UK pollinator monitoring scheme, which there's currently a European pollinator monitoring scheme being considered and quite likely to be part of the European Pollinators Initiative. But the reason for raising it is because what it contains is a method, a standardized method that allows members of the public, citizens, to gather data on the pollinator use of places that they've planted up or made available by just having timed flower counts. So you just watch a patch of flowers and you count for 10 minutes and see how many pollinators visit. It's carefully designed to be quite possible for members of the public to do, because you don't have to identify just species or anything. You do groups, and it needs a bit of training, but very little. So I put the link in the chat and people can go and have a look at that. It's one way. It's scientifically, it's kind of middling in its quality, because the data you get are not taxonomically very good, but you get some information about the numbers of pollinators using a particular patch of flowers, and then it's set in a context of a huge data set that's being built currently all over the UK, but also will be soon all over Europe. So you can see how good your pollinator conservation is.
Thank you. And yeah, we have, that's also linked to that from the All Ireland Pollinator.
Sure.
So if you're in Ireland, you can do your fit counts too.
And maybe both of you can answer the question I had actually, is how important is it when you have a plan, when you have guidance documents like the ones you were showing, Jane, to include indicators or measures of effectiveness of these, nature-based solutions, gardening interventions, and so on? How important is it to have something like, I don't know, counting pollinators, as Lynn was mentioning, flower visits? Is it something you include in your guidance documents?
It's from our point of view so far, no, not in the first phase. So in the first phase, we were really focusing on giving the guidance. I think, in the second phase, we're going to move more to, we've realized we need to monitor. We need to see how successful these things are. And I think that's something that's definitely going to come in the next 5 years.
Lynn, would you like to?
I can only say monitoring and evaluation is really important, but I think we're only just developing methods that make it possible for people to do. So it's quite new. The first point, if you're planting flowers, the first measure of effectiveness is whether you've actually got flowers there.
Yeah.
In your place.
If they have established,
Yeah.
That's where we got to with monitoring the effectiveness of agri-environment schemes in the payment by results pilot. It was just asking the farmers to record whether they had the species that they were supposed to have flowering in the patches. There was never a question of counting the insects at that point. So there's lots of levels to it.
Thank you very much. I think there are a few more questions and comments in the chat under the Q&A section. Please feel free, panelists and Jane and the panelists, to answer these questions. I think that we can move on to the last session. And really, in this case, just a second, please. I'm going to share my screen. It's well, just a thank you slide, really. But now we're going to launch a poll, as we normally do in our normal physical training courses, where we are meeting as a group, basically to evaluate the quality of the training course. So this is very important for us. It shows us where we can improve and if we have done a good job in delivering this training. So we're going to launch a poll with 5 questions. So this is a slightly longer poll, but we appreciate your honesty and your participation in this poll. Okay. And okay, so you should be able to start voting now in this poll. Oh, sorry, panelists, you cannot vote. You cannot vote here. This is only for our participants. So the final session. I mean, we've clearly had some very interesting talks and some very good speakers over the past 3 days. And this was the program. This was our program. So we have had speakers, presentations from ecologists like Lynn and Jane, but also working at the science policy interface very much. We've talked about nature-based solutions, ecosystem services, so a broad range of topics, but the common focus maybe has been how you link the scientific evidence to policy and how you integrate this in policy, and you work with practitioners and policymakers. for this last session, I would like to sort of extract some key messages. So all the panelists here are invited to contribute, and I wrote you in advance saying, well, if possible, can you identify one or maybe two key messages that come out strongly from the list of talks, from the series of talks that we had over the past 3 days? And maybe I could start, and makes my life a bit easier, because then you can add to that. Then you can add to that. For me, something which comes out really strongly, maybe because I'm a science nerd, is the need to build the evidence base. It's not there at the moment. You know, we're talking about nature-based solutions. We have been talking about multifunctionality, but we need to know more about what is effective, what is leading to increased benefits, and where it is needed. So that is something which came out really strongly the first day, but also today from Lynn's and Jane's presentations. And apart from the scientific aspect, then the second point is collaboration. When you look at all the presentations, you realize it's not a one-man show, it's not a one-team show. It's Jane working with a number of institutions, other practitioners, other researchers, and the same for Lynn, the same for Davide, the same for Marcus in connecting nature, and that is also something that we've done, which we have been trying to do in ReNature. So there's an element of networking, there's an element of knowledge sharing, there's an element of knowledge co-creation, and for me these are the two key messages. So one, build the evidence base, because it's still not there at the moment. The first day, one of the key points that we mentioned was, how do you measure all these benefits? You know, and that is what we were discussing really the first day. And the second point is, you cannot do it on your own. Maybe it's important to co-create knowledge, to share experiences. Who would like to from the panelists, right? Who would like to comment on that? And even you, please feel free to use the chat as well for our participants. Lynn, would you like to identify one key message or two key messages? You've been with us for the past 3 days all the time nearly, so that's why I'm starting from you as well, and Marcus and David.
So I propose then that what we've underlined with all these presentations and all this discussion over the last 3 days is the central part of what I would call transdisciplinary research, by which I mean research that is challenge focused and isn't just within research communities, but it's researchers working with other sectors, including business and policy. It's quite similar to your message. Nature-based solutions is kind of it's emerging as the policy response to the ecosystem services agenda, which is itself a response to researchers realizing that nature has to cut, biodiversity conservation and nature conservation has to cut across all sectors. So we've made the case that nature is important for all sectors of society and economy, and nature-based solutions is about how you do that, how you embed the solutions across all sectors of society and economy. And in order to do that, research on its own isn't enough. You have to do the research in partnership.
That's great. Thank you. I see Davide. Would you like to say something about maybe extracting a key message from the past 2 days?
I strongly support Lynn's point, and I also believe that one sort of common thread that emerged directly or indirectly in many presentations is that if we want the concept not to lose its appeal, it is time to start conducting comprehensive and systematic assessment of the consequences, of the impacts of the NBS that are already out there. We need to make sure, we need to describe to people the extent to which they're actually doing the job for which they've been designed, and also a job that is deemed important for the local communities. So I think in that we can of course benefit from the huge experience in impact assessment applied in other fields, but also come up with specific and perhaps less conventional forms of impact assessment, for example, targeted at understanding benefits in terms of social cohesion, as well as more tangible or quantifiable benefits such as costs, and for example, regulating services, for example, the heat wave mitigation, stuff like that. I think this is the next step to ensure a more systematic uptake of the concept.
Thank you. Marcus,
Well, I was going to say the same thing about the evidence base and the efficacy and developing correct indicators of that evidence measuring impact over a longer period of time than is currently planned. We currently take a shorter term view of things. We need to take a much longer term view of things. And just reflecting on what Timon and Stuart were mentioned throughout their presentations yesterday, they talked about making the evidence available in a format that is understandable. I mean, Timon showed an example of the 3D approach that Anna mentioned in her presentation, and Stuart talked about a sort of basically an open sewer, if you think about it as being a nature-based solution. So making our information accessible and understandable, but also not confusing it. It's very easy to confuse and conflate nature-based approaches in making it almost all things to all people, and that can have a dilution effect when we're trying to communicate to the policy makers that Lynn talked about. We need to make it extremely clear and understandable what exactly we're talking about, and how that is to be scaled and make it universal and linked to others, and because not all nature-based solutions, they're all different types, and are they linkable, are they connectable? So there is a tremendous amount. I agree with you, Mario. There's a tremendous amount of work to be done still. We are at the stage, I think, for nature-based solutions that we were with the Commodore 64 computer and tape recording our old tapes with the programs on it. We're at that stage of nature-based solutions, but I can see this area, and this maybe we could call it an industry. We could see it as an area that is going to very rapidly ramp up and is rapidly ramping up. And we need to make sure that the message is we're going the correct direction and not just greenwashing, as I mentioned myself before. And I can't remember what Stuart's phrase was. It's quite funny. For putting a green facade and greening and all that type of thing, and diluting what is essentially an incredibly good and worthwhile and very opportune idea of nature-based approaches.
Great. So maybe I can ask Anna about this, because Marcus also touched upon communication, and maybe Anna would like to say something about that. I mean, we've been mentioning communication all the time over the past 3 days, and then you gave up those 10 golden rules for communication and for engaging stakeholders. Yeah, feel free to say something, even about our course. How effective do you think this mode is in bringing people together and sharing their ideas? Meanwhile, Anna, if I can just remind the participants before they leave the training course to vote in our open poll at the moment, that would really be helpful for ReNature.
Yeah, thanks, Mario. Well, something that I've been wanting to say, and I nothing during my presentation, is that communication, the communication setting has changed in the past few months. We all know why. So what has mattered before in terms of social media and so on is now even more impactful. So I think the tendencies that we are having with the increase of social media users and so on are going to continue this way for a very long time, with conferences, physical conferences completely out of the picture.
Yeah, but maybe outside of social media, all social media are a reality. We cannot negate that its effect. It's there. It's very important, and they brought revolutions in countries. So that's how important they are. But apart from social media and apart from scientific fora, just like this one, what is also maybe important is these simple messages, right? Passing on simple messages rather than complex, too detailed knowledge. I mean, something Jane mentioned as well, something you mentioned is the graphs Lynn was showing, for example, about communication. I mean, they are easy to understand for everyone. It's not about the difficulty, but it's about engaging people from this different sectors. Sorry.
Yeah, and especially in the science policy interface that we're talking about.
Jane, would you like to add anything to?
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of what everyone's just said would have been my key messages as well. But I suppose if I'm going to add one thing, it's to get out of your comfort zone, to talk to people in other technical areas, whether that's as researchers, whether that's between policymakers and scientists, or practitioners and scientists. You know, this sharing of knowledge and this communication can be really hard. But we do have to get out of our comfort zone and ask those questions, you know, to say, I don't understand what you're talking about, or I don't understand where the policy window is, or what the practical limitations of implementing this. And, you know, and only by having that dialogue, otherwise we're all just going to keep going in our own little silos. So that would be my take home, is get out of your comfort zone.
That's a very strong message. Thank you very much, Jane. Thank you, George. I see the comment in the chat. George was one of the practitioners who was really active in ReNature, so we thank you very much for that and for your support over the past 2 years. May I just kindly ask our participants to vote now? I mean, we're leaving the poll open for 1 to 2 more minutes, and then I'd like to show the results to everyone for full transparency. And this also goes, of course, in our quality review of our ReNature milestones and deliverables. So we very much appreciate your participation. Okay. Okay, let's end polling and let's share the results, and we can analyze these together. I can also put them on screen. You can probably see my results now as well. So the course significantly advanced my knowledge and understanding of MBS concepts and principles. Agree was the highest, strongly agree was second highest. So we did relatively well there, I guess. Course content was organized in a clear and logical and orderly manner. We did relatively well there too, I think. Concepts have been presented in a manner that helps me learn. Okay, so most of the people are saying agree. And a few questions that we've added for the first time is about this online experience. We past 9 months, 6 months, sorry, we've moved everything online. We would have met physical, but that, as someone said, over the past 3 days, that meant that we managed to reach a wider audience as well. So it's something which went really well. So that's why the last 2 questions focus specifically on the online interaction. I think it does show that the online experience is sometimes equivalent or even better than the physical meetings. Lynn, yes?
Oh, I would just respond. So the question that says, I'm satisfied with the amount of online interaction I've had. I think that a lot of people agree with that, but there's also a fair proportion who neither agree nor disagree. I think that we have a lot to learn with how to do these kind of meetings well. So we've had a lot of interaction over the chat and in the questions and answer panel on this, but we haven't been able to hear the voices of the people who are participating. And there are ways to do breakout groups which we could try, which we haven't tried in this meeting, which we should discuss as a ReNature team to see, because I have had an experience of doing a workshop which had small breakout groups and then going back to the main session, and it was much more successful than I had expected it to be. So yeah, we should discuss that. I think we could improve the amount of online interaction, although it's been pretty good in this. Thank you very much to all the participants who have taken an active role in the questions and answers and chat. It's been really useful to hear from you all.
Yeah, it's something we would normally do in our training courses as well, breaking down in groups, breaking out in groups, and then coming back and sharing our experiences. And that is something we can try.
I think we should try it next time.
Yeah, for our next online activity. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. I think this brings the ReNature Training Course number 5 to an end. What we remind you is the Rio collection, which will be launched in the coming days or hours now, Anna. So it's something which is going up very soon. Please stay tuned, because we may also have some information about the summer school really soon. We have a physical summer school planned for January, February, PhD summer school. It's our second PhD summer school.
Winter school.
now it's no longer a summer school. Yeah, exactly. And we'll have to revise our plans to adapt to the circumstances. We remain available. Please look up the ReNature website, look us up on social media, and if there's anything we have to answer about this training course, any questions you'd like to send our speakers, please feel free to send them an email or even to forward to me, and then I will forward to the ReNature Training Course speakers. Thank you very much. Thank you, panelists, and see you next time.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you,
Very much.
everyone.
Appreciate it. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.